Hello everyone, welcome to our special interview. I'm your host Hanan Abdelrahman. Today we're going to talk about US strategy towards Africa, especially Somaliland and sub-Saharan countries. Today we have a special guest, Mohammed Abdelrahman, director of Easter think tank and also researcher and a political analyst, especially on peace, security, economic and development in the Horn of Africa. Welcome, Mohammed.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'll ask you a few questions, inshallah. Could you briefly explain for us the growing US-Africa relations?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the Africa-US relations is very important. It's very significant. It's growing these days. So when we talk about Africa, we are talking about the fastest growing population, the youngest population. We hope that by the year 2040, we will have about 40% of the world youth population. So that is how Africa is significant. It is one of the largest voting blocs in terms of UN. It has one of the largest free trade areas in Africa, continental free trade area, and it's vast. It has resources, it has young population, and it is growing, it is modernizing. So Africa is very important for everybody, not only for the US, but also the United States. We are talking about the biggest economy in the world. We are talking about the pioneers of democracy. We are talking about a country that is, or a nation that is well known for spearheading what we call digital transformation. We have all the big companies coming from the United States of America, and the United States also regional and global power that is looking at maritime security and many other issues, not the least on the issue of piracy or security, or also things to do with health diplomacy as well. So the US-Africa is a very important relations that is growing and is becoming apparently very interesting for both sides, I would say.
The United States of America has hosted the US-Africa Summit a few weeks ago. What are the positive gains for the Africans regarding the conference?
Yeah, so the US-Africa Leaders Summit, this came for the second time. We had the first one in 2014. We never had a follow-up meeting in 8 years, and that's because when President Donald Trump came, there was a major US policy shift away from Africa. President Obama was the initiator, and President Biden successfully has hosted the continent once more. There was a lot of highlights that we could look at. The United States was looking at shift away from policy of influence and competition, and also on resources, more on partnerships was this one. So you can see all the agreements and side meetings that were happening. For example, there was an MOU or memorandum of understanding or agreement between US and Africa on promoting African Continental Free Trade Area. There was also a joint vision statement between Africa-US collaboration. There was different sideline meetings between this, and there was a pledge of United States investing in Africa. So US was considering Africa this time as a partner, more on as a junior partner. So there was a lot of highlights, and I think Africa has presented its case as well, specific countries, but also on African Union. The US Summit also empowered the African Union within the framework of Agenda 2023, so that at least the Americans have done a lot of homework, we would say. For example, they have offered, President Biden has offered to work on the issues around Africa becoming member of the G20, which is very important, which is the biggest economies in the world. So I think this Leaders Summit has some key highlights. Of course, there are shortcomings in every place, but Africa has appreciated and has been able to showcase its might.
Still in the conference, the US has new strategies towards Africa. It would be fine if you elaborate more on this.
Very good. So we know that the United States of America has policy towards Africa every 4 or 5 years, and the last or the previous strategy was outlined by Mr. Bolton, who was then security advisor, top security advisor to President Donald Trump. And at the time it was more on China, and it abandoned or forgot to focus more on what Africa has prioritized, and that was the previous strategy. So this new strategy comes under new competition. We live in a multipolar world where there are so many actors competing, and each actor has to present something that is very much appealing to the any place you are going to. So this new strategy, which was recently outlined by Blinken, the Foreign Secretary for the United States of America, has focused on 4 key thematic areas, which looks at, of course, promoting democracy and human rights, but also looks at health diplomacy, because of the amid growing global health pandemics, not only on COVID, but its constant threat that's happening, but also on climate change adaptations. So these are very high important, but also specifically the United States of America is looking at partnering with Africa on what we call open societies, working with civic society actors. So these are the main objectives for the United States of America, and it looks more avenues that can partner and these African countries can look at. For example, in regard to democracy, next year alone, the United States of America will invest around more than $180 million on elections alone in Africa. We hope that around 8 countries will have general elections in Africa next year. And you look at how these countries would benefit from the American assistance or support.
Speaking of democracy, promoting democracy is among the key factors in the US strategy. However, there are complaints against the US government for having effective diplomatic and economic relations with countries ruled by dictators. How does the US government aim to enhance democracy yet build relations with countries led by dictators?
Yeah, so first of all, we have to acknowledge that Africa is becoming more, sub-Saharan Africa especially, becoming more democratic towards democracy. To qualify categorically as a democratic nation needs a lot of attributes, but at least we see a lot of elections taking place in many countries in Africa, dictators becoming less. Of course, we have what we call the third term syndrome, where some countries have tried. So for the United States of America, of course, still they will be looking at the national interests of the United States of America and security. These will be very important, and that means United States has always been known to partner countries they see as significantly strategically important to them, regardless of dictatorial or not dictatorial. But on the other side, it will be an avenue where the United States will highly promote countries that are doing well in democracy. Countries like Nigeria, Kenya, Tanzania, Ghana, all these countries are now front runners, South Africa.
Okay, so let's come to Somaliland. The US Congress approved a law that favors the 2 countries to cooperate in terms of security and military. First of all, let's talk about this law, the security one.
So this recently passed act called the NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act, is not specifically between Somaliland and the United States. It's more on American defense spending worldwide. And Somaliland has been, the name Somaliland has come up a number of times. So at least we think that the United States is interested in using the port of Berbera or the airspace in Berbera. Of course, we know that they have sent missions to inspect it. And we think that Somaliland needs some work to do when it comes how to utilize, because Somaliland would have to appreciate its name being mentioned, and that it comes along with responsibilities. For example, the act wants the United States to assess and evaluate Somaliland based on democracy, based on human rights records, and all these things is up to Somaliland how it can perform.
The Commanding General of Combined Joint Task Force of Horn of Africa for the US, Jami Shaulay, who arrived in Somaliland, said in a tweeted post, and I quote, "I had a great visit recently to Somaliland region of Somalia, where my team and I assessed the Berbera port's capacity for future deliveries of humanitarian assistance." Does that not mean the US still believes in one Somali policy?
In regard to Somaliland, we have not yet seen the United States elaborating that they have changed their previous stance. When President Bihi visited the United States, still the African Bureau tweeted that one Somalia, that's what they called. But it's not up to the US, but it's up to Somaliland to keep on knocking the doors to make sure it can make way. It is it is agenda into every country's doorsteps. And the more Somaliland performs well, I think in terms of democracy, human rights, and other governance structures, Somaliland will prevail. But Somaliland should not be concerned about the wordings that's coming from different countries, because for a country to change its policy, it will take a lot of time and action. But the visit and the mention of the word Somaliland and any sort of collaboration at any level would be a cause that Somalilanders have to appreciate.
There is a competition between the US and China in Africa. Which one do you think is good for Somaliland in accordance with its national interest?
So, in this new multipolar world, it's very important that countries should not abandon one country at the expense of the other. Somaliland responds. United States is a permanent member of the Security Council, and so is China. And it's the biggest economy. It's the second biggest economy in the world. It's the biggest investor in Africa in terms of democracy. It's the biggest investor in Africa in terms of infrastructure. So we need both so that Somaliland can knock the doors. And that's what happens in every country. If you look at Ethiopia, if you look at Kenya, we have every country. So no country would tell you you will have to either establish relations with us and severe the rest. So that is not constructive diplomacy, and that's what has damaged the reputation of former Somalia in the past, where they would either bring the Americans or would bring the Soviet, and that has repercussions. So Somaliland's primary agenda, foreign policy, is to get international recognition, and that means they have to knock the doors of every member country, not only security permanent member states, but also every country.
As we're wrapping up our special interview, how do you see US-Somaliland future relations?
Of course, positive. There has been a number of stages where United States of America has expressed interest in Somaliland, and that's always when we promote democracy. And this comes after the 2021 parliamentary and joint elections in local councils, which really appealed to everybody. It was very interesting, and now Somaliland has to hold elections this year, and that will probably be one of the key areas that Somaliland would present to everybody else. On the other side, the United States of America is very much interested in the Horn of Africa region, and Somaliland has some strategic locations that it has to continue building. So I think it is positive and it can grow, but it's up to Somaliland people how they can enhance any relations.
That's it for our special interview. Thank you, Mohammed, for joining us, and thanks, Esther. And thank you so much for watching us for our special interview. See you next time. That's it.